Hey there and welcome to yet another cool tutorial on my channel. Today I'm going to talk about context and especially using it with TypeScript. I get a lot of questions about that and I realized that I want to make a little bit more extended version of how to use context. So I'm going to create context, I'm going to create custom hooks and stuff to use the context, and also going to create a custom component in React to use the provider with your context. And lastly, I'm going to talk about memoization and how you can make your context more effective. So it's going to be super fun and I'm so eager to get started. So we have to get started now. All right, in this part, we're going to create one context. And then in the next part, I'm going to show you how to create a custom component and a custom hook to use this context and the provider for the context. And then in the last part, I'm going to talk a little about optimizing the context by memoizing the values and stuff like that. I've actually created a Vite application here, just a simple little application to have as a starting point for creating this context. So I have a lot of videos on how you can create your React project from scratch, and they also tell you about it on the Vite site. So I didn't think it was necessary to create it from scratch here. I also provided it in the starter file, so you can start from that one if you don't know how to create your own project. But honestly, if you don't know that, I think you should learn stuff like that first before you learn how to create a context in React. So I have this main component here, just the React DOM.createRoot here, and it renders out the app component. And it's in the app component that I'm going to create the context. And of course, I need to have some Star Wars references because I love Star Wars. So that's why I have a TIE Fighter as a component. And I also have a laser shot for this TIE Fighter. And it looks something like this, pretty crappy really, because I haven't styled this one at all. So I have a button here also. And for now, it just console log out click. But this one is going to change the state that's going to be in the context. And of course, I'm also going to use TypeScript because this is what it's all about in this video, really. I get a lot of questions about how to use context with TypeScript. So that's what I'm going to use also here. So let's start in the app.tsx component here. And I'm going to see what I'm going to do here now. I have to remember it also. Okay. So first, we're going to create a context, and I'm going to call it awesome context. Awesome context sounds pretty nice. Const awesome context equals. And then from React, we're going to need to import the React library also. Import React from React. Like that. All right. So from React, we have something that's called createContext. And now you can see it will complain here, because it expects one argument, it expects some initial value, but we don't give it that. So let's say that we have an initial value of null. All right, that's fine, but now we can change that. It can always only be null. So we have to have some type here for this one also. But of course, if we had some primitive values, for example, it's always going to be a number. We can initialize it with a number, and then we don't need to type it anymore because it will recognize it as a number here, as you can see. But in our case, we're going to have a state and a state setter that we create inside of this app component down here. So we can't really create it outside. So that's why we initialize it as null. And then we're going to change those values where we provide it down to the components here with the provider. So what we have to do is to create a type for our context. So type, of course, you can use interface also if you want to do that. When I'm creating React application, for somehow I like to use type. I don't remember why I choose that direction because it doesn't matter at all. So I guess it's just a personal preference. So type awesome context type. And then we have an object. We're going to provide it with the awesome state. That's going to be a number. And then we're going to have set awesome state. And that one is going to be of the type a little bit complicated here. It's going to be a React dispatch type. So what I usually do is, if I go down here, where I'm going to create this state, I have to change this because it can't be an implicit return. So here, const awesome state and set awesome state. And we create a state from react.useState. And the initial value is going to be 0. And then if you hover over here, the setter, you get the type for the setter here, so you don't have to type it in yourself. So you can see that it's a react.dispatch and it's a generic. So inside of this generic, it's a set state action, and it's also generic. That's going to be a number. So we can paste that one in up here and do some auto formatting. And there's the type for our context. And this createContext is also generic, so we can specify the types here. It can be null because we initialize it with null. And then we have the awesome context type. So this is great. Now it can be of both the type null, as we see here, and also the awesome context type that we created up here. So that's a fully typed context. If we had some object, for example, as an initial value, we could also do something like this, an empty object, and then it will complain because it's not of the type null or awesome context type. We can also set it as awesome context type to cast it like that. But I want to have the possibility to check if we really have a context set. So it's great to initialize it as null. Then I can check against that. And I'm going to use that when we create a custom hook for this context in the next part. But for now, this is enough. We have null. We have created our context and we initialize it with null. And then we need the provider for this context because now we only have the context here. And we also need to export it if we want to use it inside of our app. So down here, instead of this fragment, from our awesome context dot, we have a provider, and the provider has a prop called value. And we're going to provide it with an object. That's because I have a curly brackets, because we're entering JavaScript land, and then I have an object that I want to provide to this one. So we have the awesome state, and we have the set awesome state like that. And I misspelled this one, value. And this is essentially how you create a context in React with TypeScript. You create your context with react.createContext. Of course, you can also destructure this one out when you import it, so you don't need to specify it as React dot. I like to do this nowadays because then I clearly see what's coming from the React library here. So that's why I do that. So you create the context with createContext. Then we specify type for the context. And we specify it inside of this generic here and set it to null. That makes sure that the context can actually be null, and we can check against that when we create this custom hook. I'm going to show you that in the next part, as I told you. Then we create the state here and the state setter, and we provide this down to our React tree with the awesome context.provider. When you create a context, you always get a provider to this one. So that's how you wrap your components that you want to have access to this context. And it's a good idea to not wrap your complete application with all the context, because the context will re-render all the components that's inside of that provider when you change the context value. So that's no good. And that's also what we're going to talk about in the last part, when we're going to optimize the context to not always re-render stuff if you don't need to do that. But this is how we provide our application with this context. So now this TIE Fighter component can actually grab this value, and the value is going to be 0 initially. And then we can also grab the setter if we want to change it. So save this, and let's go inside the tiefighter.tsx file. And here I like to mark my stuff here that I import. So I mark it with context, and we're going to import awesome context from app. And we also need React in this one now. Import React from React. So we have our context. We imported it because we exported it here. So we have access to it to import anywhere we want in our application. So we have that context here. And also we import React, so we can use the built-in hook that's called useContext in React. So const awesome context. This is not the same here as the one that I import. You can see because this is camel cased. So you can name it to whatever you want, of course. But I like to be consistent here. So react.useContext. And then we provide this hook with the awesome context. Right. We can actually console log out the awesome context dot. And you can see here, this is so great with TypeScript. We actually get the auto completion here, so we know what we can expect to get from this context. And we have the awesome state here. And this context can be null, so that's why this question mark is here. And this is going to change when we create the custom hook also for this one, because then we're going to check if it's null and throw an error. But for now, we're not doing that. So we have this question mark here because it can be null. Save this one, go inside of the app. And you can see that we render the TIE Fighter and we also get the console log with 0 here. So that's sweet. And we can actually change this value also, because instead of this console log here on the button, we can call from the awesome context, we can set the awesome state. We can set it to another number, I guess, math.random, something like that. So go back to the application, click the button, and you can see that it changes here now, the random number. So that's great. We're changing this state value that we have up here in our application in the context. So this value here is changing from the TIE Fighter component. So this is how you create the context itself and how you use it inside of your application. In the next part, I'm going to show you how to create a custom component for the provider to the context and also a custom hook to use this context. Okay, let's create a new folder inside of the src folder that's called context. And then we're going to have a new file that's called awesome context.tsx. So I collect the contexts inside of here. We're going to have one more. And if we go inside the app, we can grab these ones here, the type and the actual context. Go inside awesome context and paste it in. We also need to import React from React, like that. So we have the type and the context. Then we're going to create a React component that we're going to export. Export const awesome context provider equal. We're going to have the children. We haven't typed these ones yet. So we can actually do that. Type props. I'm not using the built-in functional component in React, so that's why I have to type this explicitly. We have the children. And it's going to be a React node, like that. So, like that. So I have the children, and it's going to be of the type props. Great. And then we have an arrow function in this case. You can have a regular function if you want to have that. And we're going to create the state inside of this one instead. So move this one out of the app component like that. And we can actually make it a little bit cleaner here. We can make this an implicit return now that we don't create the state inside of this one. We can remove the React import. And we go to the awesome context. And inside of here, we create this state instead. And we're going to return our awesome context.provider with the value, the same as we had before, awesome state and set awesome state. And inside of here, we wrap the children. So that's the provider for this one. It's a little bit long here now, but yeah, you can see it's the same as we have here. So we can remove this once. We need to have a fragment because I'm returning multiple JSX elements. And by creating this one here and exporting it, we can use this one inside of our application. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go to the app.tsx file. I mark it with context and import awesome context provider like that. And instead of this fragment, we have the awesome context provider. And now we make sure that this context is going to be in our complete application because I'm doing it here at the top level of the app component. So this will be accessible from the complete application. TIE Fighter will have access to it. And also TIE Fighter has another component that's called laser shot. And this one will also have access to it by having this provider here in the app.tsx file. All right, so that's how you create this custom component for making a provider. But we want to make it even better. And we want to create a custom hook to use this context, so we don't have to type react.useContext and select the context every time we want to use it. So we also export a hook, export const use awesome context. This one has no params. I'm gonna move it up here a bit so my face doesn't so my face isn't in the way of it. All right, and here we're gonna grab the context, awesome context. Yet again, this one is the same as we do inside of the TIE Fighter. So it's this one here. We can remove this one. So you can see I can actually paste it in here. It's exactly the same. This one is camel cased, and I use the ReactJS Context and provide it with the awesome context that we created up here. And then we're going to do a little special thing here, because we don't want anyone to be able to use this value if we didn't provide the context with the provider as we did in the app. And that's why I also specified it as null here, because now it's easy to check if we don't have an awesome context, then it's going to be null if we haven't set this one. Then we can throw an error. You need to use this context inside a provider. Yeah, something like that. And then if this one is false, if we actually have a context, we return the awesome context like that. So I'm using the context here with the useContext hook built into React. If we don't have a context, we're going to throw an error that tells the user here, or the coder here that uses this one, that we don't really have a provider. Somehow we may have forgot to have this provider here. And then we can't use the state that we provide to this one, of course. And then we throw this error. Otherwise, we return the awesome context. So if we go inside the TIE Fighter, instead of this importing this awesome context, we're going to import use awesome context like that. And we create a const awesome context. And we call our custom hook use awesome context. Of course, you can also destructure out these ones here if you want to do that. So we have the awesome state and we have the set awesome state. But I think this is enough for now. We don't need to do that. But we can remove this question mark here now, because as we're throwing an error here, if you don't have a context, TypeScript will know that we must have a context if we reach this far here. So we don't need the question mark. So let's see if this works. Go back to the application, reload it, click here, and you can see that the state changes. So it works exactly the same as it did before, but we have cleaned up our code and we have created a reusable React component for the provider for this context. And we also have a reusable hook for this context. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another context also. So I create a new file here and I actually call it another context. I'm very creative today. .tsx, and we can have all this code here and put it inside of this one. So we're going to change some names here. So this one is not going to be awesome. It's going to be another, and this one is going to be another, and this one is also going to be another. I could mark them all, of course, but that wouldn't be as fun. Another, and another. Whoa, what do we have left? This one here, another. Yeah, I should have marked them all, probably. It felt like a good idea here. Another. Yeah, I marked this one. Yeah, I make 2 of them here now. Yeah, that's great. Another. So this is another context. So I guess we can actually have another value here. Let's set it to 10 or something. All right. And this context is going to be used inside of the laser shot component. So context import use another context, ran the laser shot. We're going to have const another context, use another context, just exactly the same as we did with the awesome context. And we can do some console log, another context. And we have another state. You can see that I also put in a comment here. That's what we're going to talk about in the next part to memoizing this context. But save this for now, go back to our application, reload it. Yeah, I have some error. Yeah, and that's because you can actually see here now, it throws an error because now I actually forgot to provide this context. You need to use this context inside of provider. It tells me here, okay. So of course we have to have a provider. And for this one, we're going to have a nested context. So we're going to have this inside of the TIE Fighter. So import another context provider. And instead of this fragment, we have the another context provider here. Save it, reload it. And now you can see that it works. So that is the benefit of having that throwing an error here if the context isn't set. So it's super awesome. It told me now that I did something wrong. So that's great. Click me. You can see we have the 0. This one is changing. And we have the 10. We haven't changed that one. But we know that we have that stayed here in the laser shot because it's this one that we console log out. All right. This is how you create a custom component for the provider for the context and also how you create a custom hook for your context. So in the next part, we're going to talk about memoizing this context. Okay, let's talk about memoization. And as you can see here in our application now, when I change this state, the awesome context state, it also re-renders the laser shot, but nothing really changed in that component. And that is because in the TIE Fighter, we have the provider here and we have the laser shot component here. So when we fire off this set awesome state, it's also going to re-render this component here. Because if we look in our value in another context, we have an object. We're always providing it with an object here. So that means on every render, it will have a new reference to that object. This is not a primitive number or something. If we just had a number here provided down to this one here, it isn't an object. And that means that it will pass down the number and make a comparison against the numbers. And it will be true. So it knows that the value hasn't changed. But in this case, it's an object. So it will always be a new reference to the object on each render. And that means that it will re-render the component. So we can do some stuff here. First of all, we can use the React memo, as I told you about here, even before, spoiling the surprise. Yeah, no good. So here, from react.memo, we have memoized it. That's great. So let's see what happens. Go back here, click. You can see that it still re-renders the laser shot. So why is that? Yeah, that's because just as I told you before, this one, another context, is recreating this object on each render. So it thinks that something has changed. So we have to do something here. And what we can do is to memoize this context if nothing's changed. So if nothing's changed in the context itself, it's going to use the same reference to it. So instead of just providing them down like this, we can create a const memoized context value equal react.useMemo. That's the built-in hook for memoizing stuff. We have a function and we're going to return an object. So we have the another state and we have the set another state like that. And I also need to have a comma because we need to provide the dependency array. And that is going to be the another state and set another state. So that means if nothing changed here, it's going to be the same reference to the object because we're memoizing it and telling it only change this one if the another state change or if the setter for the state changes. So instead of providing this object here, we're going to provide a memoized context value. Save it, go back to the application, reload it just in case. And now you can see that it only renders the TIE Fighter because we have memoized the value. So you need to use React Memo in combination with React Memo. So the complete component, if you don't want to re-render the component, you have to wrap it inside of react.memo. And you also have to memoize the actual value itself. And this is only useful in this context that actually is nested inside of our application, because this top level here, it's not useful to actually memoize this one, because this will also always re-render when you change it, because it's on the top level. Because I've seen a lot of people that always memoize stuff, but you don't have to do that on the top level because it's provided to the complete application, so to say. But it's always a good idea to memoize your context values, because you never know how this context is going to be used and how nested it's going to be. So it's great if you actually have something like this providing down an object to actually memoize it. So the next coder that uses this context don't need to go in and modify the context itself, because you have memoized those values. So the coder only have to memoize the component with react.memo where he or she uses this context. All right, but let's say also we have another example here. Let's say that you don't want to memoize the complete component, but you have, for example, a use effect inside of this laser shot. So we create that react.useEffect, and we have the standard function like this and the dependency array. Inside of this use effect, we do something like, for example, we can just console log out, the laser shot context. We can actually, we console log out the complete another context. And then we have another context. It shouldn't be use, by the way. It should be the another context. So you should do them individually like this. But that's because I know that you should do this. Somehow maybe someone don't know this and have the complete object here as an object in the dependency array. That means that, this one will change, as I told you before, on each render if you don't memoize it. So save it. Then we can remove this one here so we don't that console log. All right. So let's go back to the application, reload it, click. And you can see now it's memoized, it works. Even if we remove this one here, because this one is for the complete component, it re-renders the laser shot, but it doesn't run the use effect. It just runs the use effect here on the first run, but not now. So the use effect is actually memoized, but the component isn't. So it will re-render the component, but not the use effect. But if I go inside of the code again, and I don't provide this memoized context value here, and I do it like before, you can see here now that it constantly rerun this use effect because the object changes. So it depends on your use case, how you want to memoize stuff. All right, I hope this was clear enough. I'm actually going to revert this one because I want the memoized value. I hope this was clear enough for you to understand context and how to use it with TypeScript, how to create a custom hook to use your context, and also how to create a React component for the provider to be reusable. And lastly, how to use memoization inside of your application to make your context a little bit more effective and don't re-render stuff when you don't need it. But as I always say, you shouldn't worry too much about re-renders if you don't have very, very expensive operations that kicks off when you re-render something, because I think a lot of people worry too much about re-renders in React. React is fast and you don't need to optimize stuff if you really don't need to, so to say. All right, hope you enjoyed this one. Make sure to subscribe and spread the word about my channel and all my stuff here that I teach. I want this channel to grow. And thank you, and see you in another one.